My name is Laura, I'm 31, and this happened at my sister's graduation party. I'm starting there because, like most things in my family, it was supposed to be a happy day. Balloons in the backyard, folding chairs borrowed from neighbors, a banner with my sister's name stretched across the fence like proof that everything had gone right. I arrived early, not because I was excited, but because my mom asked if I could help set a few things up. That usually meant more than a few things. I brought ice, picked up extra drinks, helped arrange food on tables that wobbled no matter how many napkins we folded under the legs. By the time guests started showing up, I already felt tired. My sister arrived last, wearing her cap and gown even though it was warm out. Everyone clapped when they saw her. Phones came out. People hugged her like she'd just crossed an ocean instead of finished a degree. She deserved it. I want to be clear about that. This wasn't about jealousy. It was about what came next. As more people filled the yard, family friends, distant relatives, co-workers of my parents, I faded into the background the way I always did. I refilled coolers. I answered questions. I smiled when people asked what I was up to these days. Then my dad clinked his glass. Not a formal speech, just a casual toast. The kind that's meant to be light, funny. He talked about how proud he was, about how my sister had stuck it out, worked hard, finished what she started. People nodded. Someone said, "That's huge." Then he laughed and added, "Well, not everyone finishes college." A few people chuckled. He gestured vaguely in my direction. "Right?" he said. Laura decided college wasn't for her. More laughter. Not cruel, not loud. Comfortable. I felt my face go hot. Because in that moment, a dozen people who didn't know me just learned something about me that wasn't true, and they learned it from the people who knew exactly what really happened. Someone nearby said, "Hey, college isn't for everyone." Another added, "At least you figured it out early." They smiled at me like they were being kind. I stood there holding a plastic cup, trying to decide if I was really going to let that sit. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. Because what my parents had just done wasn't a mistake. It was a shortcut. They had taken years of stress and turned it into a punchline. When the laughter died down, I said calmly, "Actually, that's not really how it happened." The air shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. A few heads turned. Someone stopped chewing. "I didn't drop out because I didn't want to be there," I continued. "I left because I was working full-time to help pay bills here." Silence. Not supportive silence. Uncomfortable silence. My mom moved quickly. She always did when things got awkward. "Laura," she said, touching my arm, "this isn't the time." I looked at her. "I'm just clarifying," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. She smiled, but her fingers tightened slightly. "You're ruining the mood," she said under her breath. Then, louder to everyone else, "Let's not get into all that. Today's about celebrating." Conversation restarted almost immediately. Someone asked my sister about her job prospects. Someone else refilled their drink. Just like that, my reality was dismissed. I stood there, suddenly very aware of how alone I felt in a yard full of people. What stayed with me wasn't the joke itself. It was how easily my struggle had been rewritten. Not erased, reframed. Working 2 jobs to keep the lights on had become quitting. Taking on responsibility too early had become not finishing. And everyone accepted that version because it was simpler. It didn't require gratitude. It didn't require discomfort. It didn't require anyone to admit they'd needed me. I spent the rest of the party smiling and nodding, answering polite questions, pretending the knot in my chest wasn't there. But something had cracked open, because for the first time, I saw how fragile the truth was in my family, and how quickly it could be reshaped into something easier to laugh about. That was the moment I realized my story didn't belong to them anymore, and if I didn't protect it, no one else would. What happened at the party didn't come out of nowhere. That's the part that took me a few days to admit to myself. My parents didn't suddenly decide, in front of a group of guests, to misrepresent my life. They were repeating a version of the story they'd been telling for years. They'd just never said it out loud in front of that many people before. In my family, success was simple. You finished school. You followed the timeline. You hit the milestones in the right order. Anything that fell outside of that was treated like a personal flaw. My sister fit the picture perfectly. She stayed in school even when things were hard, even when money was tight, even when our parents were stressed. She stayed, and that made her easy to celebrate. I didn't. And instead of explaining why, my parents found it easier to explain me. She didn't like school. She wanted to work. She figured it wasn't for her. Those sentences became shorthand, convenient, clean, repeatable. They didn't require context. They didn't invite questions. They didn't make anyone uncomfortable. I think over time, my parents started believing them. Not because they're dishonest people, but because repeating something often enough turns it into memory. The harder parts get filed away. The urgency fades. What's left is the version that fits best into conversation. And I let it happen. That's the part I own. I didn't correct them at holidays. I didn't stop them when they told relatives I chose to leave. I smiled, shrugged, changed the subject. Part of me didn't want to sound bitter. Part of me didn't want to embarrass them. Part of me thought the truth didn't need defending. I was wrong. Because every time I stayed quiet, the story solidified. In that story, my sister was resilient. In that story, I lacked follow-through. It wasn't said cruelly. It wasn't said with anger. It was said the way people talk about weather patterns, just how things turned out. And once a family settles on a story like that, it becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. When I worked long hours, it wasn't sacrifice, it was preference. When I sent money home, it wasn't necessity, it was generosity. When I skipped vacations or birthdays, it wasn't obligation, it was choice. I remember once mentioning how tired I was after pulling double shifts for weeks. My mom laughed lightly and said, "Well, at least you're not stuck in school like your sister was." I didn't respond. I see that moment differently now. At the party, when guests laughed along with my dad's joke, they weren't laughing at me. They were laughing at the version of me they'd been given. The one who quit. The one who opted out. The one who just didn't finish. No one asked why, because the answer had already been supplied. And when I corrected it, briefly, calmly, I wasn't just sharing information. I was disrupting a narrative that made everyone comfortable. That's why my mom reacted the way she did. "You're ruining the mood." What she meant was, "You're complicating the story." Because the truth doesn't land lightly. The truth forces people to reassess past assumptions. It makes them question things they've repeated without thinking. It asks too much in the middle of a celebration. Later that night, after the party ended and people went home, I replayed the laughter in my head. Not the sound itself, but how easily it came. How no one hesitated. How no one checked my face before joining in. That's when I realized something that hurt more than the joke itself. They weren't being mean. They were being efficient. My failure fit neatly into the story they preferred to tell about our family. It explained why my sister succeeded without forcing anyone to confront the cost of that success. And as long as I stayed quiet, that story would keep doing its job. The question that lingered wasn't whether I could correct it again. It was whether correcting it even mattered to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. Because if they needed me to be the one who dropped out to feel good about how things turned out, then maybe the problem was never my path. It was how invested they were in mislabeling it. When people hear that I left college, they imagine something simple. A bad semester, a lack of motivation, a choice. That version is easy to picture because it's familiar. It doesn't require context. It doesn't ask uncomfortable questions. The real version is messier. I was 19 when things started to fall apart at home. My dad's hours were cut first. Then my mom got sick. Not the kind of sick that sends you to the hospital, but the kind that quietly drains everything. Doctor visits, prescriptions, days she couldn't work. bills that didn't stop just because she did. At first, it was temporary. That's how it was always framed. Just until things stabilize. Just for a few months. Just help us get through this part. I picked up more shifts, nights, weekends. I started skipping classes when my schedule conflicted with work. Then I skipped entire days. Then weeks. I told myself I'd catch up. I didn't. Tuition was due again. Rent went up. The power company sent a warning notice. I remember sitting on my bed, laptop open, staring at my course registration page while my phone buzzed with another message from my mom asking if I could send money. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not emotional, just math. There wasn't enough room in the equation for both, so I withdrew. I didn't make a speech about it. I didn't tell people I was dropping out. I filled out the forms, returned my library books, and picked up an extra shift that same week. Within a month, I was working full-time. Within 3, I was sending money home regularly. Groceries, utilities, gas, whatever was needed. I told myself it was temporary. That's what kept me going. What no one talks about is how quickly temporary becomes permanent when someone else's survival depends on it. By the time things at home improved, I was already locked into a different life. One where paychecks came every 2 weeks and classes didn't exist. One where my schedule revolved around other people's needs. I didn't go back to school because I couldn't afford to. Not financially, not emotionally. I was already tired in a way that doesn't reset with sleep. The thing my parents leave out when they tell the story is that I didn't disappear. I stayed. I stayed on the phone helping them negotiate bills. I stayed up late balancing my own expenses so I could send money without overdrafting. I stayed responsible while everyone else was in survival mode. And when my sister talks about how hard school was for her, she's not lying. It was hard. But it was possible because someone else absorbed the impact. Me. At the graduation party, when my parents joked about me dropping out, they erased all of that in one sentence. Years of responsibility reduced to a punchline. I don't think they did it maliciously. I think they did it because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that one daughter's success was built on another daughter's sacrifice. And that's not an easy thing to say out loud, especially not in front of guests, especially not when there's cake on the table. I never expected gratitude. I never wanted a medal. I just assumed the truth mattered. Standing in that backyard, listening to people laugh at a version of my life that was easier to digest, I realized something important. The reason my parents rewrote the story wasn't to protect my sister. It was to protect themselves. Because if I didn't drop out, then someone had to answer for why I left. And that question didn't have a comfortable answer. I didn't plan to correct them in front of everyone. That's the part people always assume, that I finally snapped, that I'd been waiting for a moment to unload years of resentment. But that's not how it felt. What I felt was pressure, the kind that builds when a lie sits too comfortably in the air and you realize you're the only one who can puncture it. After my dad's joke, after the laughter settled into that easy hum of a party continuing, I stood there holding my cup and listening to strangers talk about my life like they knew it. At least you figured it out early, one woman said to me kindly. Not everyone's meant for school, another added. They weren't being cruel. That made it worse. I nodded at first, out of habit, out of politeness, out of the instinct to keep things smooth. But then I heard my sister laughing nearby, basking in praise, and something in me shifted. Not anger. Clarity. I didn't really figure it out, I said quietly. A few people looked over. I left because I was working full-time to help support my parents, I added. That's why I didn't finish. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list details. I didn't accuse anyone. I just stated a fact. The effect was immediate. Conversation stalled. Someone coughed. Another person took a sip of their drink and avoided eye contact. The easy mood cracked, just a little. My mom reacted fast. She stepped closer to me, her hand firm on my arm, her smile still in place. From a distance, it probably looked affectionate. You don't need to get into all that, she said softly, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Today's not about you." I pulled my arm back gently. "I'm not making it about me," I said. "I'm just correcting." She cut me off. "You're ruining the mood," she said, the smile gone now, her tone sharp but controlled. "Can you not do this right now?" Right now. As if there would ever be a better time. My dad avoided my eyes. He focused on the grill, flipping burgers like nothing was happening. My sister shifted uncomfortably, her smile frozen, then turned away when she saw me looking at her. No one backed me up. No one said, "Wait, what do you mean?" No one asked a follow-up question. No one seemed interested in the truth now that it made things awkward. My mom turned back to the guests, brightening instantly. "Anyway," she said, clapping her hands lightly, "who wants cake?" And just like that, it was over. The conversation restarted. Laughter returned, forced at first, then real again. Someone commented on how nice the decorations looked. Someone else asked my sister about her job plans. I stood there, feeling like I'd said something inappropriate instead of something true. That's the moment that stayed with me. Not the joke, not the laughter, the speed. The speed with which my reality was dismissed once it became inconvenient. I realized then that my parents didn't just prefer the simpler version of my story. They needed it, because the moment I told the truth, even briefly, it disrupted the entire structure they'd built. It introduced obligation. It introduced imbalance. It introduced a debt that had never been acknowledged. Calling me a dropout erased all of that. Calling me a supporter forced it into the open. And open things demand response. Later, when people started leaving and the party wound down, my mom pulled me aside again. "You embarrassed us," she said, not unkindly, but firmly. There was no reason to bring that up. I didn't argue. I just nodded. Because arguing would have meant explaining. And explaining would have meant hoping she wanted to understand. She didn't. What she wanted was quiet. And in that moment, I finally understood something that had taken me years to see. In my family, the truth wasn't unwelcome because it was wrong. It was unwelcome because it changed the mood. And the mood, apparently, mattered more than what I had actually lived through. I left shortly after that. No announcement, no goodbye tour. As I drove home, I replayed the moment I'd spoken up, not with regret, but with a strange sense of finality. I had tried, once, clearly, calmly, and they had shown me exactly how much space my truth was allowed to take up. Almost none. The days after the party were quieter than I expected. No angry messages, no dramatic confrontations, no one asking for an explanation. Just distance. My parents didn't call. My sister sent one text about returning a dish I'd brought. Nothing else. It was like the moment I spoke up had been filed away as something uncomfortable best not revisited. At first I told myself that was a good thing. Less tension, less awkwardness. But the quiet gave me space to think. And that's when I realized something that hurt more than the joke ever did. They hadn't misunderstood my life. They had edited it. The version of my story my parents told didn't happen by accident. It had been shaped carefully over time, smoothed down until it fit into a sentence that could be delivered with a laugh. She dropped out. Those two words did a lot of work. They erased the late nights and double shifts. They erased the months I skipped meals to make rent and still send money home. They erased the fear of checking my bank balance every morning. Most importantly, they erased responsibility. If I dropped out because I didn't want to finish, then no one had to ask why I was suddenly earning instead of studying. If it was my choice, then it wasn't anyone else's burden. That's what made the story so useful. I thought back to other moments when the same pattern showed up. Family gatherings where relatives praised my sister's perseverance and then glanced at me with sympathetic smiles. Conversations where my parents framed my work history as practical instead of necessary. Every time my struggle had been turned into something smaller, something easier to digest. It wasn't that my parents didn't know the truth. They just preferred the version that didn't implicate them. Because acknowledging the real reason I left school would mean admitting they'd relied on me in a way that changed my future. It would mean recognizing that one child's achievement had been supported by another child's sacrifice. And that's a hard thing for parents to face. So instead, they rewrote the story until it sounded like failure instead of survival. The most unsettling part was realizing how often I'd helped them do it. I hadn't corrected relatives. I hadn't pushed back when they simplified my path. I'd laughed it off, brushed it aside, told myself it didn't matter. But stories gain power through repetition. The more they told it, the more real it became, to everyone, including them. By the time of the graduation party, the edited version had fully replaced the truth. That's why my mom reacted the way she did when I corrected her. Not defensive, not angry. Alarmed. Because I wasn't just clarifying a detail. I was threatening a narrative that kept everything neat. I realized then that no amount of explaining would fix that. They didn't need more information. They needed a story that let them sleep at night. And the truth, my truth, didn't do that. Understanding this changed how I felt. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was clear. Clear about why they'd laughed. Clear about why they'd shut me down. Clear about why my struggle had been reshaped into something shameful instead of something honorable. It wasn't personal. It was convenient. And once I saw that, I stopped wanting validation from people who needed me to stay misunderstood. Because you can't argue someone out of a story they depend on. You can only step out of it. I didn't announce any changes after that. No boundaries speech. No dramatic, from now on conversation. I just stopped. I stopped filling in the gaps they pretended didn't exist. The first thing I noticed was how quickly people felt the absence. A week after the party, my mom called. Her tone was casual at first, like she was testing the temperature of the conversation. "Hey," she said. "Do you know if the utility company changed their billing cycle?" Normally, I would have answered without thinking. I would have checked the account, logged in, figured it out, and called her back with a solution. This time, I didn't. "I'm not sure," I said. "I haven't been handling that stuff." There was a pause. "Oh," she said. "Okay, I thought you might know." We hung up shortly after. 2 days later, my sister texted, "Hey, do you remember which card is on file for the internet?" I stared at the message for a long time. For years, questions like that had landed on me automatically, not because I volunteered, but because everyone assumed I would take care of it. I typed back, "I don't know. You'll have to check." No emoji, no explanation. She didn't reply. The next call came from my dad. He sounded irritated, not angry, just thrown off. "There's an issue with a payment," he said. "The bank said you're listed as the contact." "I'm not involved anymore," I replied calmly. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, I'm not managing those things," I said. "You'll have to talk to them directly." Silence. Then, "You should have said something." I almost laughed. Almost. Because I had said something. At the party. Out loud. In front of everyone. But saying something didn't count unless it was said quietly, privately, and without disrupting the mood. "We'll handle it," he said eventually, his voice tight. And they did. Badly. Late fees appeared. Services were interrupted. Problems that used to be solved before anyone noticed now lingered long enough to cause stress. My sister complained more. About pressure. About being overwhelmed. About how much responsibility she suddenly had. I listened without offering solutions. One evening, my mom called again. Her voice was different this time. Slower. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," she said carefully. I let the silence stretch. "You could have told us," she added. "I did," I said. "You just didn't want to hear it." She didn't argue. That was new. What followed wasn't an apology. Not really. It was a series of small acknowledgments, questions that should have been asked years ago, hesitations before making assumptions. The narrative started to wobble, not because I corrected it again, but because it stopped matching reality. When my sister missed a payment, there was no invisible fix. When something went wrong, it stayed wrong long enough to be noticed. People started asking different questions. Who handles this now? Why didn't anyone check sooner? No one mentioned me. But my absence was loud. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't propping up a version of events that required me to disappear. And that, more than any confrontation, changed everything. The story didn't change overnight. It softened first. That's the best way I can describe it. My parents didn't suddenly start telling people the truth. There was no family meeting where everything was laid out and corrected. No big apology where everyone cried and promised to do better. Instead, the jokes stopped. At the next family gathering, no one mentioned college at all. When someone asked what I did for work, my mom answered carefully, like she was choosing her words for the first time. She works full-time, she said. She's always been very reliable. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't dismissal either. My sister stayed distant for a while. When we talked, it was polite and shallow. She still carried the weight of being the successful one, but without the cushion she used to have. Responsibility felt heavier when it wasn't theoretical. One afternoon, months later, she called me. Not to ask for help, just to talk. I didn't realize how much you were doing back then, she said quietly. I really didn't. I didn't rush to respond. I know, I said. She waited, like she expected me to fill the silence with reassurance. I didn't. We changed the subject. That was the closest we came to acknowledgement. My dad never brought it up directly. But he stopped making jokes. He started asking questions before assuming things were handled. Small changes, but noticeable. My mom changed the most. She started checking in, not just when something went wrong, but randomly. She asked about my work schedule, about whether I was tired, about whether I needed anything. One day, she said something that surprised me. I shouldn't have said that you dropped out, she admitted. That wasn't fair. She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. Because I finally understood something important. I didn't need them to retell the story correctly for me to move on. I just needed to stop living inside the wrong version of it. What changed the most wasn't how they talked about me. It was how I talked about myself. When people asked why I didn't finish school, I stopped minimizing it. I didn't explain apologetically. I didn't laugh it off. I had to work, I said. My family needed me. And I left it there. No defensiveness, no shame. Just fact. I stopped stepping in automatically. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't mine to carry. When I showed up, it was because I wanted to, not because I was expected to smooth things over. The strange thing is, the more I did that, the calmer everything felt. Not perfect, but honest. Looking back, that graduation party wasn't the moment I was embarrassed. It was the moment I finally saw how easily survival could be twisted into failure if it made other people more comfortable. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. They didn't take anything from me that day. They revealed something. They showed me how fragile the truth becomes when it inconveniences people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And they showed me something else, too. That I didn't need their permission to tell my story correctly. I just needed to stop letting them tell it for me. That was the real graduation. Not from college, but from a version of my life where I carried responsibility quietly and accepted mislabeling as the cost of love. I didn't finish school, but I finished surviving. And that's something I don't laugh about anymore.